And this is the kind of model that I take as a geologist and a scientist when I approach a particular problem. I hold the Scripture very closely, of course, as a Christian, but I'm also a scientist, and so I've been trained to look at the rocks, examine the rocks, find data, interpret data, make hypotheses, go out and do field work and examine the rocks carefully, and so on. So as a scientist, I'm over here in the science domain. I develop hypotheses, and then I go out and make observations, maybe perform some experiments, do analyses, and then interpretation and so forth. And then maybe as a result of that, I have to come up with a new hypothesis and test that as well. And that's pretty much what scientists do. They stick in that realm and go through that process of hypothesis development and hypothesis testing. We do a similar thing in Scripture, don't we? When we take a piece of Scripture and we want to understand the Scripture, we look at the ancient languages, we look at the words, we look at the verbs, we try to find out what context they're used in, we read commentaries, we find out what other people have thought about it, and so on. And as we do that process, we come up with an understanding of a particular passage. And of course, we compare different passages in Scripture. So if there's some theme that we want to study in Scripture, we just don't look at it in one passage. We look at the whole body of Scripture and what it has to say about that. This diagram has been put together by Leonard Brand, and he has, in my opinion, written brilliantly about this in a book called Faith, Reason, and Earth History. The third edition of this has just come out, and it's really a philosophy of science book. And so if you're interested in a class and teaching a class on philosophy of science or something like that, this would be a very good book to get. And he's just published a third edition with Art Chadwick as the second author, and it's actually available as an ebook. And there are ways to get it for free as well. And they did that on purpose. I think if you buy the book, it's about $50, but they made a free edition, especially so they could use this book in foreign countries and so on to help people think through this issue. But Leonard Brand suggests that these things don't exist by themselves. We don't just have science over here and religious ideas and concepts over there, but these two things should interface with one another. And as a geologist who is a Christian, I long for that kind of biblical integration. I long to integrate what Scripture says and integrate that and have it align with what science says. But oftentimes the two things don't agree. Oftentimes we have some conflicts between the two. And so what do? When we find conflicts in science, that forces us to go back to Scripture and read and try to understand the Scripture better, to see if we've missed something or if there's a connotation that we need to look at here or there again. But the other thing applies as well. As we read Scripture, we read, for example, in Genesis 6, 7, 8, and 9 that there was a flood. And every indication in that passage as we read that seems to indicate that was a global flood. And to me as a scientist, especially as a geologist, that presents some interesting hypotheses that I can test. To have a hypothesis, the hypothesis can come from anywhere, right? The trick is to go and test that hypothesis to see if it works or not. And so as I go out to the field and look at rocks, I have a hypothesis about the flood. And so the Scripture tells me something that maybe a scientist wouldn't ordinarily think of. It gives me a hypothesis that I can test that maybe another scientist with a different worldview wouldn't think of. And so as I and others have looked at the Coconino, we've looked at the Coconino perhaps through slightly different lenses, and that has allowed us to find some things in this sandstone that others have overlooked. And I think it's allowed us to find some very important things.